The bus terminal in Independence, Missouri always smelled faintly of reheated coffee and cold linoleum. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed in indifference, casting a sterile glow over the place. It was 6:12 a.m. when Harold L. Brooks stepped inside the weight of his duffel bag hanging heavily from his shoulder. A weather-worn envelope was tucked into his chest pocket, a precious bundle that clung to the memories of his past. His movements were slow, deliberate, each step measured like the ticking of an old clock, counting down to something that felt both distant and inevitable. He was dressed in a long wool coat too heavy for the spring air. It hung on his frail frame, worn down by years of service, but the fabric still held the shape of a man who had once been proud, once strong. A canvas military cap, unmarked and faded, sat low on his brow. But the only thing that still spoke of his past was a sliver of a red ribbon tucked beneath his collar, barely visible but enough to say something that no one would listen to. His brown hands, knotted and stiff with age, gripped a wooden walking staff. The staff had seen more miles than most people could ever hope to walk in a lifetime. It was a companion in his journey, not just for support, but for memory, carrying with it the stories of places he had been, battles he had fought, and promises he had made. As Harold shuffled forward, his worn boots making soft echoes against the linoleum, the young man at the ticket counter barely glanced up. The clerk, chewing gum and tapping away at the keyboard, looked up just long enough to see Harold standing there, disrupting whatever important thing he was scrolling through on his phone. "Next," the clerk muttered, a tone of indifference laced with impatience. Harold stepped forward, unfolding a small handwritten note from his pocket. The paper creased and yellowed. His voice, low and steady, broke the stillness of the terminal. "I'm trying to get to a town called Redfield, Montana. Is there a route that gets me close?" The clerk glanced at Harold, then back at his screen. His eyes met Harold's for a brief moment, then quickly looked away. "Redfield, never heard of it. That's a reservation or something," he said dismissively. Harold's face remained unchanged, his features as weathered and worn as the memories tucked deep inside him. "It's about an hour outside Billings. I can transfer buses if needed." The clerk barely acknowledged the response. He tapped away at his keyboard, exaggerating each key press, before stopping abruptly. "Sir, I need an ID if you want to buy a ticket." Harold nodded as if he had expected this. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn leather wallet, the edges frayed from use. Inside, a military-issued VA card, yellowed with age, peeked out alongside a Missouri ID that had expired 3 years ago. The clerk frowned as he inspected the expired ID. "This ID's expired. It's me," Harold replied, his voice soft but firm. "I don't drive anymore, but I have cash." Behind him, a mother and daughter stood in line. The girl whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "He smells funny." The mother pulled the girl closer, her eyes darting with subtle disdain. A clear judgment passed over the old man in front of her. The sighs and whispers around him were a chorus of disregard. The next person in line sighed in impatience. The clerk leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Look, sir, you're going to need a valid ID. That's the rule. I can't just sell tickets to anyone who walks in off the street." "I'm not just anyone," Harold replied, his voice still low, but carrying a weight of quiet dignity. "This trip, it's for someone who never came back." There was a pause. Harold's words hung in the air, but the clerk didn't seem to notice. He turned to his screen, typed with exaggerated slowness, then stopped and shrugged. "I'll have to call my supervisor. You can step aside." Harold didn't argue. He nodded once, stepped away from the counter, and lowered himself onto a cold metal bench along the wall. The duffel bag rested heavily on his lap, like a memory too heavy to put down. Around him, the terminal buzzed with life luggage, rolling phones, ringing vending machines, humming, but no one saw him. Not really. They saw old. They saw slow. They saw brown skin and silence. They didn't see the man who had once carried a wounded pilot on his back through 6 miles of enemy jungle. They didn't see the man who had sat beside that same pilot's son just 2 nights ago, showing him a photo the boy had never seen of his father smiling beside a young, private first-class Harold Brooks, somewhere in Laos in 1969. Harold's gaze drifted to the door as the overhead speaker crackled. "Bus 417 to Kansas City, now boarding at Gate 2. It wasn't his bus. Not yet. Harold looked at the gate. It wasn't his bus, but he had no place else to be. His bus hadn't arrived yet, and neither had the respect he used to wear like a second skin, the kind that only faded when people stopped remembering where it came from. It was nearly 7:10 a.m. when the rain started, fine and silvery like dust falling sideways, the kind of rain that crept into shoes, into cuffs, into bone. Harold looked up through the terminal windows as the rain began to fall heavier, soaking the streets outside. Still no one noticed him. No one offered him a seat, and Harold didn't ask for one. He never did. He sat upright on the cold bench, watching the gate, feeling the weight of his promise and the years that had passed since it was made. The rain pattered against the glass like a quiet reminder that he had walked through storms before, both literal and metaphorical, and would keep walking until his promise was fulfilled. In the stillness of the terminal, Harold Brooks sat alone, his tired eyes gazing out at the gray rain as it streaked down the glass. His hands rested on the worn handle of his duffel bag, the silence around him thickening with every minute that passed. Outside, the rain had grown heavier, the first sheets of water turning into torrents that soaked the sidewalk, blurring the city's edges. But inside the terminal, nothing had changed. The hum of the fluorescent lights above was constant, a soft drone, but the air felt colder now, more distant. His bus hadn't come, and he hadn't expected it to. People had walked past him without a second glance, each absorbed in their own lives. None offering a seat, none offering anything. The bus station was a place for waiting, a temporary stop on the way to somewhere else. But Harold wasn't just waiting for a bus. He was waiting for something no one could give him. As the minutes turned into an hour, the voices in the terminal grew louder, more urgent. People talked about destinations, schedules, connections, and the coming of the next bus, but no one spoke to Harold. No one offered a kind word. He didn't mind. He had never asked for kindness, and he certainly never expected it. The loudspeaker overhead crackled again, announcing the next bus departure. Bus 311 to Cheyenne, now boarding at Gate 3. Please have tickets and IDs ready. The announcement sliced through the murmur of the terminal like a sharp wind, making Harold's gaze shift to the gate. His heart didn't race. It had already made its peace with the endless waiting. But his hand, with its stiff, worn fingers, instinctively reached for his jacket pocket, checking once more for the crumpled cash he carried. $47 in bills, folded and packed with military precision, nestled in the folds of his coat. It was all he had. Harold slowly rose, his joints creaking with the effort, his cane tapping against the floor. The rain outside beat against the terminal windows as he made his way toward the counter again, his footsteps quiet but deliberate. The same young clerk from earlier looked up, his eyes catching Harold's for just a second before flicking away. "I was hoping to get a seat on 311, Harold said quietly, his voice steady despite the weight of the years behind it. The clerk barely glanced up, tapping his gum with an exasperated sigh. "Like I told you before, I can't sell you a ticket without a valid ID." The clerk responded, his voice sharp, now louder than before. His eyes shifted over Harold, looking him up and down like a problem he had to solve before moving on to the next. "It's not about where you sit, it's about who you are." Harold's gaze didn't waver. "I'm still the man I was." The clerk raised his eyebrows, clearly not impressed, his fingers tapping idly on the counter as if counting the seconds until Harold would leave. But Harold didn't move, not yet. The old man stood his ground, the weight of his journey and his promise like an invisible anchor holding him in place. There was a brief silence between them, long enough to feel heavy in the air. Harold's eyes were focused, unwavering, as if trying to communicate something the clerk wasn't willing or able to understand. The moment passed quickly, and Harold stepped back, lowering his gaze as the clerk turned away, already dismissing him. It didn't matter. The words had been said, and sometimes that was all there was to it. Harold moved to sit back on the bench, his coat heavy with water from the rain. The terminal's sterile lights reflected off the slick tiles beneath his feet. The sound of the vending machines continued their drone, punctuated by the occasional announcement, and Harold was once again lost in the rhythm of waiting. But this time, there was something different. Something was changing, though he couldn't yet put his finger on it. He lowered himself back onto the metal bench. His duffel bag rested heavy on his lap like a burden he could never put down. He hadn't asked for this life, but it was his, just as the memories of the past were his to carry. He would keep moving step by step until his promise was fulfilled, and then he felt it a shift. Across the room, through the haze of the terminal's buzzing activity, a figure stood out. A young man with a messenger bag, pale and tousled, scanning the room as if searching for something. His gaze landed on Harold for a moment, a fleeting moment, but it was enough. The young man hesitated then, with a slight frown moved in Harold's direction. His name was Evan Whitmore, a college student from somewhere far away. Harold could see the uncertainty in his movements, the curiosity that flickered in his eyes. Evan looked like someone trying to understand something he couldn't quite grasp yet. He moved closer until he was standing just a few feet away from Harold. There was a pause and then Evan spoke. "Is everything okay?" he asked quietly, his voice gentle but laced with a hint of concern. Harold looked up, meeting the young man's gaze. For a moment there was no need for words. It was as if the world had shifted and Harold was no longer invisible. He didn't answer right away. His fingers gripped the edges of the photo inside his jacket pocket, feeling the edges of the past like they were tangible things. "Just waiting," Harold said finally, his voice soft. Evan sat down beside him, looking out at the rain, though his eyes were drawn to Harold's worn figure. For a long time neither of them spoke. The sound of the rain outside grew louder, a rhythmic pulse against the quiet hum of the terminal. But in that moment Harold didn't feel so alone. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was familiar, like the silence of old friends who didn't need to fill every gap with words. But eventually Evan broke the stillness. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "You don't seem like you're going to Kansas City." Harold's eyes flicked to the departure board where the next bus was being called. "Redfield, Montana," he replied. "I'm going to keep a promise." Evan turned toward him, his expression softening. A promise, he asked, intrigued. Harold looked at him, and for the first time since he'd entered the terminal, his voice cracked slightly. "A promise I made a long time ago. To someone who didn't come home." Evan nodded as if understanding without needing to ask more. After a long silence, he looked back at Harold, his tone shifting. "There's a bus headed west in 90 minutes, he said, reaching into his backpack and pulling out his phone. "I can get you on that one." Harold looked at him, surprise flickering across his face. He didn't respond right away. Maybe it was the unexpected kindness, or maybe it was just the realization that someone, even a stranger, had noticed him. Whatever it was, Harold felt a shift. Something in him softened, though, only slightly. "You don't need to," Harold said slowly, though his voice lacked the usual weight of refusal. "Maybe I do," Evan replied simply. "Maybe I do." Harold stepped off the bus in Redfield, Montana, his boots hitting the cracked pavement with a soft thud. The town felt quieter than it had any right to be. Dust swirled in the air, caught in the bright spring sunlight that was beginning to stretch its long, hesitant rays across the land. Harold stood for a moment, taking it all in. He had never been here before, but the town with its lonely crossroads and scattered homes felt familiar. It was the way the hills rose in the distance, the way the wind whispered through the trees. His memory, though weathered, still held the layout of this place. He could see it now, even if he had never set foot in it until today. Evan stood beside him, the younger man's eyes scanning the surroundings, as if he too was uncertain of what to expect next. Harold didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He had walked through far worse in his life, and though the years had dulled his body, his purpose was sharper now than it had ever been. They walked through the town, slowly making their way toward Denton's Supply Co., the faded red paint on the storefront clinging to the memory of better days. The bell above the door jingled as they entered, the musty scent of old wood and dust greeting them like a forgotten memory. A young man stood behind the counter, his sandy blonde hair pulled back into a messy knot. His sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms lined with the marks of hard work. His eyes were tired but alert, scanning them as they entered. "Help you folks?" he asked, his voice a little too loud, as if trying to push away the weight of the silence that had settled in the store. Harold stepped forward, his hand reaching into his duffel bag. He felt the weight of the envelope, his mission, beneath his fingers, as he pulled it out and placed it gently on the counter. The faded photograph in Silver Star metal still nestled inside, waiting to fulfill the promise he had made so many years ago. "I'm looking for Caleb Dorsey," Harold said, his voice steady, but carrying a depth of emotion that few could understand. The young man blinked, looking from Harold to the envelope in his hands. "That's me," he said, his voice faltering for just a second. "You knew my grandpa." Harold nodded, his eyes never leaving Caleb's face. The weight of the past hung between them like a bridge that had never been crossed until now. "I knew him," Harold said quietly. "We served together." He earned this. He opened the envelope, pulling out the silver star with the same reverence he had carried it through 3 states. He placed it gently on the counter, the gleaming metal catching the light in a way that made it almost seem alive. Next, he unfolded the old creased photograph. Caleb's eyes widened as he picked it up, his jaw slackening in recognition. The faces in the photograph were faint with age, but the joy captured in the image was timeless. 2 young soldiers, shirtless and covered in mud, laughing beneath a makeshift camp sign. One of them was Harold, unmistakable in his youth, strong and proud. The other a young man with a shy smile and a dog tag that read Dorsey L. "That's him," Caleb said, his voice barely a whisper. "I never saw him like this. We don't have many pictures of him in uniform." Harold's fingers traced the edges of the photo. "He volunteered for a transport mission outside the zone," he said softly, his voice distant. "Ambush hit the convoy, took the first bullet through the windshield. He bled out before backup could get to him." Caleb didn't say anything. He couldn't. The photo trembled slightly in his hands as he looked down at it, his eyes filling with unshed tears. "I never knew how to remember him," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "But now I do." Harold nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "He made me promise. Whoever went first, the other would find the family and return this, to make sure his memory lived on." Just as Caleb's hand began to tremble more, a loud voice interrupted their quiet moment. The door swung open and a deputy in a tan uniform stepped into the store. He glanced around, his eyes falling on Harold, then narrowing in suspicion. "Someone said there were transients loitering outside," the deputy said, his voice sharp. "That true?" Caleb blinked, startled. "What? No, not at all. What's going on?" The deputy's eyes flicked between Caleb and Harold, and his hand rested on the radio on his belt. His gaze was cold and dismissive as he turned toward Harold. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step outside while we sort this out." Before Caleb could protest, Evan, who had been standing quietly by the door, stepped forward. His voice was firm, his tone rising with the kind of determination that came from seeing something that wasn't right. "He's not loitering," Evan said, stepping between the deputy and Harold. "He's here to deliver something. A promise. A silver star to Caleb Dorsey, his grandfather's medal. Harold Brooks, you know, the man who saved your family." The deputy's eyes flicked to Caleb, who stood tall now, his expression changing from shock to resolve. Caleb turned to the deputy, his face set in an unfamiliar hardness. "You know him?" the deputy asked, disbelief creeping into his voice. "I do," Caleb said firmly, his voice gaining strength. "He saved my grandfather's legacy. He kept his promise." The deputy paused, the harsh edge in his voice wavering slightly. He looked at Harold, then at the silver star still gleaming on the counter. His suspicion didn't fade, but the weight of Caleb's words settled over him like the slow realization that he had misjudged the situation. "You sure?" the deputy muttered, his skepticism still present. But before Caleb could respond, Evan pulled out his phone, unlocking it with a purposeful swipe. "Want to see the Department of Defense's Veteran Archive?" Evan asked, his voice unwavering. "Maybe you should check out the Congressional Registry of Silver Star recipients. We can spell his name out for you." The deputy stepped back, his hand twitching near his radio. But Caleb, unfazed by the deputy's doubts, turned to the bulletin board on the wall. He plucked a small obituary from the pile of old yellowed clippings. It was a story about his grandfather, Leonard Dorsey, a local hero who had died before Caleb was born. At the very bottom, written in ballpoint pen, was a barely visible line. "If Harold finds this, we kept the house." Caleb held the clipping up to the deputy, his voice quiet but firm. "This is the truth. If you don't believe me, you can ask anyone who was there. My grandfather was one of the quiet ones, but Harold's the one who made sure he was never forgotten." The deputy's face flushed, a mixture of confusion and shame flickering across his features. Without saying another word, he turned and left the store. As he stepped outside, the door clicked shut behind him, and the air in the store felt less oppressive. The tension in the room, which had threatened to suffocate them, lifted. Harold turned to Caleb, his gaze steady as the young man folded the obituary and placed it on the counter beside the silver star. The metal gleamed in the light, no longer just a decoration, but a testament to a promise kept, a bond unbroken by time or distance. "Thank you," Caleb whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to say it, but thank you." Harold gave a faint smile, the lines on his face softening slightly. "Promises don't expire," he said quietly, his voice steady yet filled with years of unspoken weight. Harold Brooks stood at the edge of the town square in Redfield, Montana, staring up at the flagpole that stood tall but empty. The town had a way of being quiet when it wanted to, as if the land itself had learned to hush in reverence. The rain, which had started as a light drizzle in the morning, was now pouring down in sheets. But Harold didn't mind. He had stood through storms before, both the kind that soaked the skin and the kind that soaked the soul. The town square was almost completely deserted, except for a few scattered townspeople rushing to stay dry, umbrellas bobbing in the distance. Evan Whitmore, who had been with Harold through the long journey, stood beside him, the folded flag now securely tucked under his arm. His hair was wet, his clothes damp, but there was something steady about the way he held himself. Perhaps it was the knowledge that he had become a part of something larger, something that would be remembered long after Harold was gone. They waited in silence. Then from behind them, the sound of car engines grew louder. One by one, vehicles began to pull up along the curb of Main Street, their headlights cutting through the rain. The first were pickups, sturdy, hard-working trucks belonging to farmers and ranchers who hadn't bothered to wait for the weather to clear. Soon after, a few cars arrived, their drivers shivering in the cold as they stepped out and hurried into the crowd that had begun to gather. Harold watched as townsfolk, veterans, and strangers alike gathered in a loose circle around the flagpole. They spoke in hushed tones, casting occasional glances at the elderly man who stood in their midst. No one knew what to say to him, but there was a growing sense of something shared, something understood. The rain continued to fall, a steady rhythm in the background, but no one seemed to mind anymore. In the midst of the quiet, the mayor stepped forward wearing a thick coat and a somber expression. He was a man used to giving speeches, but there was something different in the air today. Something that made the words feel heavier, more meaningful. "Thank you all for being here," the mayor said, his voice carrying through the steady rain. "This morning, as the rain began to fall, we gathered to honor a man who never asked for honor. A man who walked across 3 states carrying with him a promise that he had made to a fallen comrade. A promise that he kept even when the world had forgotten." The mayor paused for a moment, glancing at Harold. "Harold Brooks," he continued, "came to our town not to be recognized, not to be praised, but to return a legacy that had been lost. He carried it through storms, through cold, through doubt. And now, because of him, we remember. We remember those who served, those who sacrificed, and those who came home not in uniform, but in spirit." Harold shifted slightly, feeling the weight of the moment. He hadn't come for applause. He hadn't come to be remembered by name. He had come to keep a promise, and in doing so, he had reminded this town of what it had forgotten. The promise was never his to break, and he had done what he said he would. The crowd was still now, the weight of the mayor's words hanging heavy. The man in the crowd, a local veteran with silver hair and an old-worn jacket, took a step forward. His hand went to his forehead in a salute, and then slowly others joined him. A few more saluted, then more, until the entire group stood at attention, their hands raised to their brows in a tribute. It wasn't for Harold, not exactly. It was for the men and women who had served, for those who had fallen, for the ones who had been forgotten. It was for the promise that had never been broken. Harold stood still, his back straight, his eyes focused on the flagpole ahead. As the crowd saluted, Evan stepped forward, holding out the flag to Harold. The old man took it, his hands trembling slightly as he unfolded it with practiced precision. The flag, once carefully folded, now pristine, felt like a symbol of something much greater than the fabric it was made of. It was a piece of history, a piece of dignity, a piece of memory. Harold raised the flag, his movements slow but deliberate. The wind picked up as the flag unfurled, snapping loudly in the heavy rain. The crowd stood in silence, watching as the flag rose toward the top of the pole, its bright colors now more vivid against the gray sky. Harold's fingers, stiff with age, fought against the rain as he secured the flag in place, but there was no hesitation. The rain soaked through his coat, trickling down his face like the passing of time itself. And for the first time in years, Harold felt something shift inside him, not a relief, not a weight lifted, but something far more significant, a sense of completion, a sense of peace. When the flag finally reached the top, Harold stood back. His hand went to his brow in a formal salute. It wasn't for him, it was for the men and women who had served, for those who had fallen, for those who had kept their promises. And then, as the flag snapped in the wind, Someone from the crowd began to clap. The sound was tentative at first, unsure, but then it grew louder. A clap of recognition, a clap of understanding. Soon the clapping spread from one person to another until the entire crowd had joined in. It was quiet at first, but the sound began to build like the rain tapping against the ground, building into something steady, something undeniable. But Harold, ever humble, shook his head and held up his hand. "No applause," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the years. "Not for me." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of a life lived with honor. He looked out at the crowd, his eyes passing over the faces of the townspeople, the veterans, the strangers, who had come to honor him. And then he spoke, his voice soft but firm. "For Leonard," he said, nodding toward the flag, the memory of his fallen friend clear in his eyes. "For the ones who didn't come home." The crowd fell silent again, a quiet reverence passing between them. And then, as if on cue, Caleb stepped forward, still holding the silver star in his hands. The metal glinted in the rain, its silver sheen reflecting the light. Caleb had never understood what legacy truly meant, not until now, when he held his grandfather's medal in his hands, passed down from one soldier to another. Evan stood beside him, watching as the moment stretched on the town of Redfield, beginning to feel different. People were standing taller, their postures shifting as if they had been reminded of something important. It wasn't just the flag, it wasn't just the ceremony. It was the recognition of a promise kept of an old man who had walked through storms to honor something bigger than himself. The rain continued to fall, but now it felt like something cleansing, something that washed away the years of neglect. The town would carry Harold's memory not just in the stories they would tell, but in the simple act of remembering. And in the distance from the back of the crowd, a woman with a camera lowered her lens, tears streaking her face. She hadn't pressed record. It wasn't necessary. This moment was already eternal.